I'm your host, Chadillac, with the Cage Rage Podcast.
I'm Miguel, the archivist at the International Brotherhood of Prize Fighters. I'm glad to join you here at the Cage Rage Podcast.
Hello again, everybody. You are with the Cage Rage Podcast. This is Chadillac, your host, and fight analyst Miguel Iterati. Miguel, what's going on today?
A lot of good stuff, Chad. Glad to be back here at the Cage Rage Podcast. And you call it what we're going to talk about: history, new stuff.
You'd started out talking a little bit ago before we were filming, and some of the things you hit on that were really interesting is just the idea that baseball, football, soccer, those kind of sports are a culmination of multiple races and nations. And even sexes for that matter. Whereas fighting, combat sports are a one-on-one sort of thing, unless maybe you're doing tag team wrestling, and we're talking about real sports, right? So I loved the idea of you putting pugilism into the facet of it's a man versus another man. And all race and all nationality is checked at the door, so to speak. And if it's not, then maybe we settle it as sort of the Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome way. But let's hope that that's better than dropping bombs on one another or people coming into synagogues and shooting each other up. Take it away, man.
Well, first of all, there's a lot to talk about there, obviously. So my condolences. And all I want to do is bring an honorable mention to Jews in boxing as a little bit of a tribute, as a little bit of a memory to something. Because what happens to me, I think we talked about it in the Jack Johnson podcast a couple of podcasts ago. So somebody wants to go back about it, and that's where Joe Choynsky came up. And at the end of the day, you had a white Jew from San Francisco, kind of well off, wealthy, against a pretty poor black person from Texas. Choynsky fought till 1904, so this fight occurred pretty much in the last year of his career. Before he went on to become, just kind of like a celebrity boxer kind of thing and that sort of stuff, So the bottom line is rather in the last couple of years of his career, he fought Jack Johnson. So he was coming towards the end, but at the end of the day, we talked about how they spent 3 weeks in jail, and after that, there was some ties between the two where Choynsky handed some ringcraft over to Jack Johnson. And you're talking about a white man and a black man in 1901 that the sport brought them together in some way. When they measured each other, I'm pretty sure that the Jews wanted Choynsky to win, and that the blacks probably wanted Johnson to win. And then, the general fans that didn't have a blood association with either of them, probably were going to bet it or probably wanted Choynsky as the white guy, to be quite honest with you.
Sure.
So, but there's no taking ethnicity out of it. But at the end of the day, what happened is in the ring, they sort of left it aside when they spent 3 weeks in jail together. They were equals, they were handing, not even equals, but they had assumed a relationship maybe of like peer, of like professor and teacher teacher and student kind of thing. And that's interesting because that kind of erases the white guy versus black guy thing. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And that's like what sport does in the long run. Sport is something that's supposed to bring us together. So hopefully by bringing sport, maybe a little tribute to the Jews in boxing, where they really held their own as Jews, for many, many years, and have some of the most colorful and interesting characters out there. To be honest with you, as a historian of boxing or somebody who loves the history of boxing, we do owe a little bit of something to the Jews for what we know there. And it's very simple, At the end of the day, their culture has, the history. They have communities. They, see themselves as Jewish. And basically, what I'm getting at is the story of this shirt, which commemoration of champions should probably start with Daniel Mendoza. Mendoza, a Jew in England in the 1700s, that became the boxing world champion to the point that he was the first Jew documented to shake the hand of the king, you know, that sort of thing. And Mendoza is a guy that we have 40 fights documented on, and that doesn't happen with any of the other bare knuckle boxers. You know, not James Figg, not James Broughton, not anyone in between. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They just we you know, Jem Mason stuff. You start to get a record, and when with John L. Sullivan, you can put together a record of their exhibitions and stuff from newspaper accounts and things. So there are a lot of guys there, but 40 fights from the 1700s of a guy that, you know, wrote a book on the art of pugilism, on the defensive style, and is in some circles credited with being the first to throw an uppercut type of punch.
Is the book that he wrote? Did I see you handling that earlier? Is that massive brick that you had, or?
No, Daniel Mendoza, the champion from the 1700s in England, the Jewish champion. His book, you know, he wrote it in his life, and it was a scientific book on boxing. Okay. And it was basically just called The Art of Boxing. So a simple book, but it's available out there on Amazon and things like that. You can find it. But again, here's a situation where, because why do we know so much about him? Because the Jews document their fighters. The Jews, you know, in their newspapers, and their, you know, over here they had a bar mitzvah, and over here they're documenting their society. And and our little boy boxer's proven himself out there and stuff. So we've got documentation on it, and we don't have that now. And at the end of the day, that's all we can live on is what we're left from the past. You know, that's why I love the newspaper so much, because you get away from you know, hearing, you know, something that's a slant. You know, a lot of the books from those ages, you know, literature's come a long way. Writing has come a long way in the 20th century, into the 21st century. Now, with the sound bites, it's changed even differently. You know, so, yeah, you know, some of the older accounts you got to read with a historic perspective as well. The book I was handling was, where did I put it? Over here. This is the book.
Yeah, what's that opus?
Last week when we were talking about Jack Johnson and Joe Choynsky, I mentioned Crystal Force's book, which is called The Choynsky Chronicles, and this is the book. It gives you an idea of, you know, about how thick it is. It's, you know, getting to be about 800 pages.
Yeah, I mean, you're starting to look like you've got a David Foster Wallace book in your hands there, or you're reading Pynchon. So
yeah, I mean, it's
up my alley. I like that. So let's talk about this real quick first. Let me just touch on one of the things that you said that I thought was really interesting, and that's that they recorded that the Jewish community recorded everything, including their fighters, and so you're talking about they're recording fighters at a time when they would also be arrested for doing what they were doing. So it's prize fighting, and it's, you know, considered you know, illegal in whatever way, by whatever legal definition they have at that time. To the point where Jack Johnson spends 3 weeks in jail with this guy, and, you know, it's sort of like you put two guys on a deserted island, and all of a sudden they're not Japanese and American, they're just two guys on a deserted island trying to live. And you know, they fight the greater beast, which is, you know, nature itself, and let's hope that something good comes from all of these terrible things that we're seeing right now. But without going too deeply into that and getting preachy about it, I do want to acknowledge that I really appreciate how you put that, and it feels like more of that needs to happen right now. How do we use an analogy of boxing and two guys fist fighting? What is the analogy between that and sort of the, I guess, the Rocky IV kind of analogy with Dolph Lundgren and Sylvester Stallone as the USSR and the USA at the height of the Cold War? you know, and doesn't it feel a little bit like we're back there again, and we sort of need something to pull us all together, and maybe combat sports has something to do with that?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely a good way where, if you mimic the fighters, and that's kind of what you look to do, you mimic the fighters and at a professional level, once we've gotten to the point where we're professionals, how many times have we seen, where, I'm talking about smaller level fighters. I'm not talking about McGregor and Mayweather. You know what I mean? But how many times have we seen the guys compete, heading into the fight, they're all piss and vinegar and don't like each other, and after the fight, they may be doing shots together.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and that crosses boundaries, and that could also, to me, is the kind of thing that, should carry over into the public, right? Because, it's at the end of the day, if we're civilized, you're going to be able to sit with the guy and have a drink and say, fuck, you beat me, or fuck, and did we beat you, whatever the situation is. And it doesn't always extend itself that way, right? Humans are humans, right? So if your NBA team wins the championship, people go out and burn cars, right? Shouldn't they just go and say, to the Laker fans and say, hey, great game, and, see you next year, or whatever, because at the end, that's what's going to happen, right? They play again, right? So, but people get caught up in the moment. But if you, in sport, it's different than in boxing. Boxing, because of the one-on-one nature, I think you got a real shot. If you break it down, in England, when they do fights that are Ireland versus England, in general, that I think the lines are very firmly, divided there. I don't think there's a lot of Irish rooting for the English dude, and I don't think there's a lot of English dudes rooting for the Irish dudes. You know what I mean? I could be wrong, I guess, but I just don't see it that way. I know, in the States, if you got Mexican versus a black fighter, or Mexican versus, Eastern European guys, those audiences, the Eastern European guys, sometimes you're hearing the audience, you're like, gee, they're chanting USA, it's Russia, they're chanting Russian, in Russian the way they say it, and there's so many of them there. I remember seeing Polish fighters were huge backings and things like that. So it's just a deal where, I think it's natural they're going to back their guys. Now, in boxing, you kind of got to accept it. It's one-on-one, right? You go to a Polish versus black fight, and you hope they don't turn into Bo Galata, right? And that's the thing, is Bo Galata is an extreme and terrible example. But, how many times has that matchup been done? A black guy versus a Polish guy in a gym in Chicago, you know what I mean? I mean, that type of thing happens all the time. And, yeah, there's a rivalry. The black guys probably want to win for, with some black pride. The Polish people speaking Polish and with their crowds screaming for them and stuff like that are certainly, wanting to beat the black guy, you know what I mean? But it's within the context of sport. It doesn't cross over into being something ugly, I think, And that's what sport has to show us, that you can leave things behind and that the difference, and then, with the winning and the losing, you're never going to be, it's proven at the end of the day that nobody wins them all, right? So
Absolutely.
At the end, that interchange of sometimes you win, sometimes they win, and that stuff, I think that's all healthy for, correcting some of the stigmas from so long ago, I guess. Is that a contribution? That's all I got, really, because, bring it back to boxing and sport. I think it's important, but, but those are all there. We could go back to the first time, black boxers are documented in boxing. It's very interesting. Story of Tom Molyneux and an American slave freed and who went on to boxing prevalence, fought for the championship and lost in England, and that was black versus white in those fights.
Yeah,
the race thing. I think one of the things that may have been a mistake, and this is just complete opinion, but one of the things that may have been a mistake in some of the discourse over the last, 50 years or whatever, is some idea that everything was going to be all right and that we were all the same. And I think, that everybody's the same. And I think Trump is cashing in on that when he says, I'm an American. Yeah, being an American to me means I live next to a family from Sri Lanka, and there were, I played basketball with black kids, and Spanish kids and Latino kids, and there was that melting pot thing, and that's America. You know, not necessarily it goes back to like, does Trump mean that, or does Trump mean a more white America? And in that case, now you're into politics and stuff. You know, so I don't know, but I do know.
Well, and then look, we've got to look at the idea of the term the Great White Hope. You know, where does the Great White Hope come from? I mean, that in and of itself indicates that the entirety of that is racism. But I think you say something that's pertinent, and that's that we're not going to get away from that just because it feels ugly or because it feels like a bad thing. That exists within us. You know, sexism exists within each and every one of us. Tribalism exists. There's an awful lot of research that indicates that it's passed on from 500,000 years of genetics. You know, from when we stood up and started actually kind of walking around and you know, looking over the weeds. But without getting too deeply into that, when we talk about the Great White Hope, did Jews see themselves historically in boxing as a great white hope at some point, or did they never have to be there? Because although Jews are predominantly in my worldview white, Jews aren't necessarily Caucasian the way that we think of Caucasians in the United States. And I know it's a touchy subject, but I mean, I'm not that afraid to. We're adults, and if you can't handle talking about an adult conversation, then maybe this isn't the podcast for you, because we're going to explore some things that aren't necessarily always comfortable. So talk to me a little bit about where did the Great White Hope lie within the Jews? Did they even have that, etc.? And kind of extrapolate on that a little bit for me.
All right. You know, it's not an easy question, and we'll focus it on Choynsky. The bottom line to me is that the Great White Hope gets tossed out there periodically by promoters, and it touches upon the subject we're talking about, which is racism. And how blatantly they used it, you know, I don't even know, you know, I mean, in the 80s, they very, very, very firmly used it around Jerry Cooney.
Absolutely.
You know, so
he was the Great White Hope on Sports Illustrated. On the cover, it said the Great White Hope. It's the first time I'd ever heard the term.
And Sports Illustrated might have you know, a historical reason for putting it on there, because it is a historical term. Choynsky may have at one point qualified as a type of white hope. I think being from San Francisco, I mean, the bottom line is Choynsky fought his first fight in the 1880s.
Okay.
So you're talking about, you know, you're talking about a different. He retired in 1904. So Johnson, you know, was just a pup still, not a world champion yet or anything like that. When they met in 1901, Choynsky to me is an interesting character because he's from San Francisco, right? So the guy, San Francisco at the time was very much a city, you know, at the end of a huge road, you know what I mean? San Francisco, Los Angeles, California was starting to build up and things, but you know, to get there was very far. But so it was like an island and very much a cultural place, you know, and that's why you had a million of people: Jews, Hispanics, blacks, you know, free blacks getting away from things, you know, businessmen. You know, businessmen with low moral value, you know, and then you have guys looking for their fortune, you know, the gold diggers and the gold rushes and everything like that. So
plus you have the Chinese, the Chinese immigration was massive.
Certainly, absolutely. The Pacific, you know, access gave them, you know, a very different vibe and feel than New York, than the East Coast. They already had that back then in the 1880s, and Choynsky's from there. You know, so Choynsky, you could, for example, one of the things I find notable about him is that in the 1890s, coming up as a boxer, he fought a lot of the black champions, or the black, you know, the guys that they wouldn't fight, that John L. Sullivan wouldn't even touch. You know, Joe Goddard, Peter Jackson, guys like that. And Choynsky fought him. You know,
okay, hey, Miguel, real quick, let me cut you off there. real quickly, tell the audience why Sullivan wouldn't fight them versus why Choynsky would.
Oh, I mean, it just comes because I think it's because Trotsky's Jewish. In many ways, the Jews were also a minority, and though he's white-skinned, very much he carried the fact that he had to be a Jew. So it wasn't easy for him to get fights or do whatever he had to do. And he wasn't that's why I also meant he wasn't a true great white hope. He wasn't like Jim Jeffries or one of those guys.
Right.
But carried himself more, along. He was also smaller, so he wasn't quite, around. The Great White Hope started with once Jack Johnson won the belt, they needed somebody to beat him.
Yeah.
And that's where the idea, I think, originates, right? So now you got Johnson.
Is that a fact? Do you know that to be a fact, or are you just taking a stab at it on that?
I mean, I'm gonna say that it's a fact, though.
Okay.
I'm open to being corrected on it because I don't have I can't cite the exact place. In certain things, I'll cite you my source.
I would love to hear some commentary in the comments about that. Subscribe below and talk about that in the comments and let us know what you think on that. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No problem. There were no black champions. Then you had, Johnson come in, win the belt, and then start to become difficult and become a thing. And the first great white hope to me is James Jeffries. Jeffries, a former champion, a guy, who in his career had, I'm just going to double check my sources here.
And he moved up in weight, right?
No. Jeffries was.
Okay, I'm off there. Okay.
Choynsky was small, and he fought Choynsky. In 1897, they fought to a draw. So it gives you an idea. But this guy was the guy he'd never lost up until that very last fight when he fought Johnson. So this was the guy that they were bringing back. He only had 20 documented fights or so, but he was considered the guy that nobody'd be able to beat, and that was, or that could redeem the white race rather. That was the first great white hope, Jim Jeffries. James J. Jeffries. So,
hey, and Miguel, real quick, just so the audience, just so the audience is familiar still with what the rules differences are. Explain what a draw would have meant in terms of rounds and the punishment that they would have taken then versus what a draw would mean today.
Okay,
just real quickly.
In the 1890s and the fights that we're talking about here are documented Marquis de Queensberry rules. So they had gloves, even though the gloves may have been very much smaller and not look like the gloves we have now, but they would wear gloves. And the rounds is open to interpretation. Early in Choynsky's career, he had many open round fights. In other words, fights to the finish. If you went 80 rounds, you went 80 rounds. That kind of stuff. So
and the round was decided when someone was knocked down.
No, that we're talking about Marquis de Queensberry at this point.
Okay,
I expect a 3-minute round. Yeah, it was prior to that. He's probably got fights before that are documented differently with the rounds and stuff.
Okay.
But here you're talking about 3-minute rounds, and in general, fights are 20 rounds.
Okay. That's what I wanted to do. I just wanted to make sure that the audience understood that when you say a draw in the 19th century, it's not the same thing as a draw in the 21st century. So
no, the craziness of it goes beyond, that's what reading the history of it, especially in newspapers and things, and the current accounts, and then you tie into that things like, the police record, things like that, which, for so many years documented the sport that they could do things like, hey, 40 years ago today, this is what was going on and things in the record and things. So truly, the old documentation presents a really rich and fabulous sport to me. Each of these guys was already a huge character. Joe Choynsky, definitely a character. He loved, to show up in his suits, tailored suits, and to show off. Being Jewish meant some, the stereotypes of being wealthy and stuff like that. Well, he lived that. He wanted to portray himself as an upper crusty Jew.
Yeah.
When we were talking about that, one of the names that escaped me in our last podcast about Jack Johnson from the era of other white champions and things was Jack Root. And Jack Root was the guy I was talking about, who also wealthy, died in his 80s, and he used to write retrospectives of this of old boxing and stuff like that. But Root, Choynsky, Jeffries, these guys all died with money and stuff like that, or at least lived a life where after boxing they were celebrities and people were looking at them again because they were well known, all of them.
They didn't die in an asylum broke with not a nickel to their name, which is impressive.
Right.
Okay. Okay.
And then, I mean, with Choynsky, like I said, a lot of what you have there is you've got, and I think you see it with Abe Patel, you see it with a lot of Jewish boxers from that era, is you've got a fervent Jewish support. And in some cases, and I say this without a lot of deeper knowledge, but, support of a Jewish mafia, of, power brokers and people who are involved in, making sure things are going to go right for you and things like that. It's I think there was definitely an aspect of, when it comes down to it, maybe it's just bookies making money off of their guys. But
it's still organized crime in one way or another.
That's what San Francisco and boxing was. I mean, when you talk about a draw, a lot of the times the fight was decided by the ref. There was no 3 judges.
Yeah.
That stuff came later.
Yeah.
And then from there, that makes the choice of refs very interesting. It's documented that actual, Wild West legend Wyatt Earp was a referee for matches and things. And actually,
really?
Had a relationship with Tex Rickard when both spent time in Alaska looking for gold, whatever you call it, prospecting or whatever. So yeah,
Wyatt Earp was a boxing referee at one point.
Oh yeah, and with 6-shooter at his side and everything,
he actually had the revolvers on his side in the ring.
We're gonna need to dedicate a podcast to it because
that's crazy. Yeah, that's a whole different sub. Yeah, we'll make a note for that one for sure.
It's not like, well, he reffed a match and it's like, no, it was controversial and the 6-shooter, there's a story behind it. So I'll get the story straight for you. But yeah, when you're talking about going to, Choynsky being from San Francisco, that's where, he was able to fight black guys, before that in the 1890s and things like that, and get away with it. You find other fights, Hey,
let me ask you this real quick. This is kind of a side note, so we'll come back to this. But what if, rather than Choynsky being the fighter that knocked out Johnson, what if that would have been Sullivan? Would Sullivan have done 3 weeks in jail for that same fight?
Look, I
know that's speculation. I'm just asking, just in general. What do you think?
My feeling is, and let me just check up on some of this stuff, but I just don't think it could even really happen because
I'm saying in a fantasy world where where the two would have been lined up in time, etc., and that if it could have happened.
I didn't want to mess up my facts. I mean, Sullivan is 10 years prior.
In other words, had that been a white heavyweight fighter who was a popular man, would he have gone to jail, or would Johnson have been in that jail cell by himself?
They would never have fought.
It just would never have happened because of the race barrier and the idea that the white man could have lost.
Yeah, Sullivan was very big. Here's the thing: is some fighters get accused of, they were racist. They were racist, but are they still in heaven? No one should be in heaven, and that's a philosophical question. I don't want to get into philosophy and stuff, but were they all bad people because they just didn't like blacks, or just was it something that they just grew up there and they had to, I'm not sure that they all had a story, but you had to be a white person and say certain things against the blacks, or else you may lose support of other people. So it was an ugly time.
Yeah, absolutely.
You were talking about, and that's where the 10 years where Sullivan and that separate Sullivan and Choynsky make a Choynsky possible. San Francisco rises as an outpost, a country, on the other side of a wasteland, you know, all across the mountains and desert and stuff like that. Not a lot going on there until you get to San Francisco and California, you know. So they could do their own things over there, and you know, I think they thought of themselves too as a little bit more erudite and advanced, you know. So Choynsky lived that way, and I think that's where that comes from. Sullivan, being from Boston and being white from Boston, just was a completely different person, you know. Brought up and been. So I don't think the circumstances would have matched up. Let me mention this because I don't. But for fans or for people who really want to focus on the racism discussion, you were talking about how, you know, in this day and age, you know, when we were talking about the Jack Johnson fight, and again, go back and check the Jack Johnson podcast. I think it's a good podcast. But
yeah, that was an excellent
Jack
podcast.
Johnson fight in Australia, where those dudes, you know, in Australia cut off the video at the end to not prevent the black man doing it. And you're like, it was 19, you know, whatever it was. You know, so however many years after slavery. I mean, do you know what Birth of a Nation is?
I'm sorry, what?
Do you know what the movie Birth of a Nation is?
Yes, I know what Birth of a Nation is. Yes, of course.
Okay, and that's, I just want to reference that was 1915.
Yeah.
That was a full 50 years after slavery. So, you know, to ask about 1902, I think what the right thing to do is to give Choynsky props kind of for being a little bit of an advanced thinker, a person who maybe was willing to take the risk or didn't give a fuck, but he fought blacks. It wasn't aligned to him, you know? I think he deserves props for that as well.
Agreed.
And at the end of the day, you know, the Jews and the blacks, that's a very good rivalry in boxing and stuff like that. And they have no real traditional hatred for each other from history or anything like that. So it could be a real beautiful sport rivalry where at the end of the day they shake hands and you know, view each other with respect. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in this day and age, kind of what we're seeing a rebirth of right now in the United States. And I know you're not in the U.S., so I know it's relevant to you because you're an American, and I know that you keep up on it. But being here, the heart of this feels so differently than it has in the past. And the reason that it feels different is that it feels as if there is a group of people who have been the majority, who have been the privileged, and who have been the empowered and the entitled for their entire lives, which would be people like you and I, white men, who suddenly have this idea that they are being discriminated against and that they're not going to take it anymore and they've just had enough. And you hear this rhetoric over and over again when these attacks happen and when the marches come in and when the neo-Nazism is talked about and the nationalism. You hear this constantly, and I don't want to lend any credence to that, because to try and compare the two is ridiculous. But at the same time, I think the men who are saying that deserve to be heard, and they deserve to be validated for what they feel, and then they need to be educated as to why what they feel does not line up with what historically has happened. And I think that's what we're seeing so differently right now. So that's just, excuse me on that, that's just commentary on my part. Okay, so Miguel, having said that, and a little bit of my own rhetoric and commentary there about where I feel white privilege is at, male privilege is at, and you know, the idea of check your privilege and that kind of thing can be extremely offensive to you know, a white farm boy like me in the middle of nowhere who doesn't necessarily feel like I've gotten some kind of great advantage by being white, but that's because I haven't had to recognize the advantage and the entitlement that I have. And so in that way, I think we need to validate what these people are saying to some extent. But where I think Trump is missing is that his rhetoric incites more of it rather than say, we understand that you feel that way, but let's look at this in retrospect and do some real comparison before you start to shout reverse racism or that affirmative action is somehow destroying your life, etc. So, having said that, that's just my own personal commentary. Take me into some of the guys on your shirt that were also Jewish champions, and let's talk about a few of them while we've got a little bit of time left here to do it.